I remember the day vividly, March 15th, a crisp Saturday morning in Boston. The sun streamed through my bedroom curtains as I awoke with a flutter of excitement in my chest. Today was supposed to be special. My sister Olivia's 25th birthday celebration was happening at Maison Rouge, that upscale French restaurant downtown that everyone had been raving about for months. I'd even bought a new dress for the occasion, midnight blue with silver accents that I thought made me look sophisticated, mature, qualities I desperately wanted my family to see in me. The week before, I'd overheard Mom and Dad discussing the reservation with Olivia. They were planning for 15 people, and I naturally assumed I'd be among them. Why wouldn't I be? Despite our occasional disagreements, I was still family. I'd even set aside some money from my modest salary at the marketing firm to buy Olivia a silver bracelet I knew she'd been eyeing at Tiffany's. It had stretched my budget thin, but family celebrations mattered to me. I was applying the finishing touches to my makeup when my phone buzzed. Mom's name flashed across the screen. Unusual, I thought, since she rarely called me on Saturday mornings. "Morning, Mom," I answered, my voice light and cheerful. There was a pause on the other end. "Rachel, honey," she began, her tone instantly setting off alarm bells in my head. "About today's dinner." My hand froze, mascara wand suspended in midair. Something in her voice made my stomach twist into a tight knot. "We've had to make some adjustments to the guest list," she continued, each word carefully measured. "It's going to be a fancy place, not your type. I hope you understand and don't make a drama." Not my type. Those 3 words echoed in my mind, harsh and dismissive. What did that even mean? That I wasn't sophisticated enough? That I would somehow embarrass them? "Mom, what are you saying exactly?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just that." She hesitated. Olivia wanted to keep it intimate. "Just close friends and immediate family. You know how you and she haven't been getting along lately." A trivial argument from 3 months ago. That was her justification. My sister and I had disagreed about something so inconsequential I could barely remember it now. Something about her borrowing my car without asking. "I see," I said, though I didn't see it all. The room suddenly felt colder, emptier. "There will be other celebrations," Mom added quickly, as if that would soften the blow. "Maybe next week we can do something, just the 4 of us?" After hanging up, I sat motionless at my vanity table, staring at my reflection. The excitement that had filled me just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. The carefully applied makeup now seemed pointless, the new dress hanging in my closet a monument to my naivety. Throughout the day, I distracted myself with mundane tasks, cleaning my apartment, catching up on work emails, anything to keep my mind occupied. But as evening approached, knowing they were all gathering without me, the pain sharpened. I scrolled through Instagram, a masochistic impulse driving me to check Olivia's profile. Sure enough, stories were already appearing. Elegant table settings, champagne flutes clinking, familiar faces laughing together in the ambient lighting of Maison Rouge. I switched off my phone and curled up on my couch, wrapping myself in a blanket despite the warmth of the spring evening. Memories of previous family gatherings flooded my mind, now tainted with a new perspective. Had I always been the outsider? I recalled Christmas dinners where my opinions were politely acknowledged then swiftly dismissed, family vacations where my preferences were overlooked in favor of what Olivia wanted. This exclusion wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern I'd been too blind or too hopeful to recognize. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down my face and ruining the makeup I'd so carefully applied hours earlier. I didn't just cry for today's rejection, but for years of subtle dismissals and diminishments. My family had always treated me as somehow less interesting, less accomplished, less worthy of their attention and respect. As I sat alone in my apartment, the familiar sounds of the city filtering through my window, a thought crystallized in my mind. I deserved better than this. The realization didn't ease the pain, but it kindled something else within me, a quiet resolve, a determination that had long lain dormant beneath my desire for approval. That night, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer chase after their acceptance or validation. Instead, I would focus on building a life so undeniably successful that they couldn't help but see my worth. Not for their sake, but for mine. Little did I know then how dramatically that promise would reshape my life, or theirs. As I finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from emotion, I couldn't have imagined the path that lay before me or the strength I would discover within myself. The bitter taste of abandonment lingered, but alongside it grew the first seeds of a transformation that would ultimately redefine me. In the quiet darkness of my apartment, with the distant sounds of Boston nightlife as my only company, something shifted inside me. The Rachel who had woken up that morning, eager to please, desperate for inclusion, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who understood that sometimes the greatest catalyst for change is the sting of rejection. 2 years passed since that fateful birthday dinner. 2 years of minimal contact with my family, of polite but distant phone calls on holidays, of declining invitations that felt more like obligations than genuine desires to see me. 2 years of pouring myself into work with an intensity that surprised even me. The marketing firm where I'd been just another associate had become my battleground. I stopped waiting for recognition and started demanding it, presenting bold campaign ideas that initially raised eyebrows, but ultimately won over our biggest clients. Within 8 months, I was promoted to senior strategist. 6 months after that, I became the youngest director in the company's history. But even as my professional reputation grew, something felt incomplete. I was excelling at a job I had chosen almost accidentally after college. The thought nagged at me, was this really what I wanted? Or was I just proving a point? The answer came unexpectedly during a business trip to Portland. I was there to pitch to a potential client, a small but innovative coffee roastery looking to expand nationally. Something about their passion resonated with me. The owner, Marcus, spoke about coffee cultivation and roasting with the same reverence an artist might discuss their craft. By the end of my 3-day stay, I wasn't just helping them with marketing strategy. I was learning about sourcing, flavor profiles, and the complex economics of the specialty coffee industry. On my flight back to Boston, a crazy idea took root. What if I didn't just market businesses but owned one? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I had savings, substantial ones, given my rapid career advancement and frugal lifestyle, but nothing close to what starting a business would require. Still, the seed had been planted. I began researching, reading everything I could about the coffee industry, connecting with suppliers, and quietly scouting potential locations in Boston's up-and-coming neighborhoods. 6 months of preparation later, I was ready to make my move. I approached a bank for a business loan, armed with a meticulously detailed business plan. They turned me down. So did the next 3 banks I visited. Too risky, they said. No experience in the industry, they explained. Each rejection stung, but also hardened my resolve. Then came a stroke of luck so perfect it almost felt like divine intervention. A venture capitalist named Eleanor Jenkins attended a conference where I was speaking about digital marketing strategies. She approached me afterward, impressed by my presentation. Over coffee, ironically, I found myself sharing my vision for a specialty coffee shop that would revolutionize how Bostonians experience their daily brew. Eleanor didn't just listen, she understood. 2 weeks later, she offered to invest, a sum so generous it made my original plans seem modest by comparison. With her backing, I didn't just lease a storefront. I purchased the entire building in Somerville, a 3-story brownstone with commercial space on the ground floor and residential units above. Bean and Brew opened 6 months later to lines around the block. The concept, part traditional coffee shop, part educational space where customers could learn about origins and brewing methods, resonated in a city filled with students and young professionals. Within 3 months, we were profitable. By month 6, we had been featured in Boston Magazine as the city's must-visit coffee destination. But the real game-changer came from an unexpected quarter. One of our regular customers, a tech entrepreneur named James Wilson, approached me with a proposition. He had developed an app that allowed coffee lovers to pre-order their favorite drinks and pick them up without waiting. The technology was solid, but he needed a partner who understood the coffee industry to scale it nationally. The opportunity was too perfect to pass up. I used every penny of my savings and took out a significant loan to buy into his company. It was the biggest risk of my life, one that kept me awake for nights on end questioning my judgment. 18 months later, Brew Swift had been adopted by coffee shops in 12 major cities. 6 months after that, a multinational beverage corporation offered to buy us out for a sum so large I had to ask them to repeat it twice to make sure I'd heard correctly. At 31 years old, I became a millionaire. The wealth brought security and options, but what I valued most was the validation. Not from my family, I had long since stopped seeking their approval, but from myself. I had built something meaningful, something that succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. My new financial status remained my secret. I moved to a modest but elegant brownstone in Beacon Hill, invested wisely, and continued to run Bean and Brew, which had expanded to 3 locations across the city. To most observers, I was merely a successful small business owner, not someone who could purchase entire city blocks if she wanted to. It was during this period of quiet triumph that I received the invitation. A cream-colored envelope with my mother's distinctive handwriting. Olivia was turning 27, and they were celebrating at La Perle, Boston's newest and most exclusive French restaurant. The same sister who hadn't bothered to call when Bean and Brew was featured in national press. The same family who still treated my business success as a curious hobby rather than the empire it was becoming. My first instinct was to decline, to continue my life separate from them. But something made me pause. The invitation felt like fate, an opportunity to close a circle that had been left painfully open. That evening, sitting in my home office overlooking Boston Common, I found myself researching La Perle. The restaurant had opened just 3 months ago to rave reviews, securing its place as the city's most sought-after reservation. It occupied the ground floor of a beautifully restored historical building in Back Bay, owned by a mysterious European investment group. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not out of malice or revenge, but from a deep-seated need for closure, for recognition, not just of my success, but of the pain their dismissal had caused. With trembling fingers, I reached for my phone and called my financial advisor. "Daniel," I said when he answered, "I need information on acquiring a restaurant. Specifically, La Perle in Back Bay." The wheels were set in motion. A plan was forming in my mind, one that would finally bring my journey full circle and perhaps, just perhaps, heal the wounds that had driven me for the past 2 years. The acquisition of La Perle proved more complex than I initially anticipated. The European investment group, primarily Swiss and German financiers, showed little interest in selling their prized Boston location. My first offer was politely declined. My second, substantially higher, earned me a meeting with their representative, a stern-faced man named Klaus Weber who flew in from Zurich specifically to tell me, in person, that La Perle was not for sale, at any price. I respected their position but refused to accept it. This wasn't just about buying a restaurant anymore. It had become a mission, a necessary step in reclaiming something I hadn't even realized I'd lost. My sense of agency, perhaps. Or my dignity. What if, I proposed to Klaus during our second meeting, I don't buy the restaurant itself, but rather the building it occupies? His eyebrow lifted slightly, the first crack in his impassive demeanor. "The property is valued at—" "I know exactly what it's valued at," I interrupted, sliding a folder across the polished conference table. "And I'm prepared to offer 20% above that valuation, all cash, with a 10-year lease guarantee for La Perle at below market rent." 2 weeks and countless negotiations later, I became the owner of one of Back Bay's most prestigious addresses. While I didn't own La Perle directly, I held something potentially more valuable: their lease agreement. A contract that, upon careful examination with my legal team, contained several interesting clauses regarding management rights under specific circumstances. With the property secured, I moved to the next phase of my plan. I hired Sarah Chin, a private investigator whom a business associate had recommended. Her assignment was simple but specific: gather all possible information about the upcoming birthday celebration for Olivia. Sarah was thorough, providing not just the reservation details, but the entire planned experience, from the private dining room booked under my father's name to the special 7-course tasting menu they had requested. Meanwhile, I cultivated a relationship with Philippe Laroche, La Pearl's executive chef and partial owner. We met ostensibly to discuss the terms of their continued tenancy, but our conversations soon expanded to his culinary philosophy and ambitious plans for the restaurant. Philippe, I discovered, was as passionate about his craft as he was frustrated by the financial constraints imposed by his investors. They understand money, not food, he confided during one of our wine-fueled discussions. They demand I cut costs while maintaining authenticity, as if true French cuisine could ever be created with inferior ingredients. An opportunity presented itself, one that aligned perfectly with my larger plan. What if, I suggested, refilling his glass with the Bordeaux he had been eyeing, you had a partner who understood both? Someone willing to invest in your vision without compromising your standards. Philippe's eyes narrowed. You wish to invest in La Pearl? But you already own the building. I'm interested in participating more directly in the restaurant's success, I explained. A silent partnership, perhaps? You maintain complete creative control. I provide additional capital for those imported French butters and that small batch olive oil you mentioned. 2 days before Olivia's birthday celebration, I became a 30% owner of La Pearl. The paperwork was expedited, the transaction kept quiet from the other investors, a minor ethical gray area that Philippe assured me was perfectly standard in the restaurant business. With both property ownership and a significant stake in the restaurant itself, I now had the authority I needed for what would come next. My plan was taking shape, each element falling into place with a precision that both thrilled and terrified me. The night before the celebration, I couldn't sleep. I paced my Beacon Hill home, second-guessing myself, questioning my motives. Was this elaborate scheme really about healing old wounds, or was I simply executing a painfully sophisticated revenge fantasy? The line between justice and vengeance felt increasingly blurry. At 3 a.m., I called the one person who knew the full extent of my plan, my friend Tara, who had stood by me through the darkest days after that first rejection. It's not too late to back out, she reminded me gently after listening to my doubts. You've made your point just by acquiring the place. You don't actually have to go through with the confrontation. But would I know that? I asked. Would they ever understand what they did, how it affected me, if I don't show them? Tara sighed. Rachel, honey, I love you, but ask yourself this. Are you doing this so they'll understand you, or so you can finally understand yourself? Her question haunted me through the sleepless night and into the morning. As dawn broke over Boston Harbor, casting long golden rays across my kitchen where I sat clutching a cold cup of coffee, I reached a decision. I would proceed, not out of malice, but as a necessary closing of a chapter in my life. This wasn't about humiliating them. It was about reclaiming my narrative. I spent the day meticulously preparing. I selected my outfit carefully, a tailored black Armani suit that projected confidence without ostentation. I reviewed the dossier Sarah had prepared one final time, committing to memory the details of the evening's planned progression. I called Philippe to confirm our arrangements and to ensure the staff had been briefed on the modified protocol for the evening. Everything was set. As afternoon faded into evening and I prepared to leave for La Pearl, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Whatever happened tonight would bring resolution one way or another. The uncertainty that had plagued me, about my worth in my family's eyes, about whether my success would ever be enough, would end. I took one last look in the mirror before leaving my home. The woman who stared back at me wasn't the hurt girl who had sat alone in her apartment 2 years ago. She was composed, resolute, powerful in a way that transcended the expensive clothes or the financial success. For perhaps the first time, I truly recognized myself. Ready? I asked my reflection. The woman in the mirror nodded, her eyes clear and determined. Yes, I was ready to confront not just my family, but the part of myself that still carried the weight of their rejection. Ready to show them, and myself, exactly who Rachel Bennett had become. La Pearl glowed against the twilight Boston skyline, its elegant facade illuminated by tasteful lighting that highlighted the restored 19th century architecture. I arrived 30 minutes before my family's reservation, giving myself time to settle my nerves and confirm the final details with Philippe. He greeted me at the private staff entrance, his chef's whites crisp and pristine despite the evening service already being in full swing. "Everything is arranged as you requested," he assured me, leading me through the bustling kitchen. Line cooks and sous chefs moved with practiced precision, barely glancing up as we passed. "Your family has not yet arrived, but we've prepared the Versailles room exactly to specifications." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "And the staff understands their instructions?" "We, of course. Though they are, how you say, tres curieux about tonight's special circumstances." His eyes twinkled with a mixture of amusement and respect. In the weeks since our partnership had been formalized, Philippe had come to appreciate my attention to detail and uncompromising standards, qualities that mirrored his own approach to cuisine. He escorted me to a small office adjacent to the dining area, where monitors displayed security camera feeds from throughout the restaurant. "You can observe their arrival from here," he explained. "When you are ready, Marcel will notify you." Left alone, I watched the restaurant's main entrance through the monitors. The evening crowd was typical for a Saturday at law. Pearl, wealthy Bostonians, visiting celebrities, the occasional tourist who had managed to secure the coveted reservation months in advance. I recognized several prominent faces: a tech billionaire at table 7, a Hollywood actress tucked discreetly in the corner banquette, a state senator holding court at a center table. At precisely 7:45 p.m., I saw them arrive. My father first, distinguished in his charcoal gray suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed. Then my mother, elegant as always in a midnight blue dress that I noted, with a pang, was nearly identical to the one I had bought for Olivia's birthday 2 years ago. Olivia herself came next, radiant in cream-colored silk, followed by her husband Michael and a parade of friends and extended family, 15 people total, just as Sarah's intelligence had indicated. Marcel, the maitre d', greeted them with practiced charm, checking their reservation before leading them toward the private dining area. I felt my heart rate accelerate as they disappeared from the main camera's view, only to reappear moments later on the feed from the Versailles room. I watched as they settled in, accepting flutes of champagne from circulating servers, exclaiming over the opulence of the room with its gilded moldings and crystal chandeliers. They were celebrating, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. A soft knock at the office door broke my trance. It was Marcel. "They are all seated, Madame Bennett. The first course will be served in approximately 10 minutes. "Thank you, Marcel." I stood, smoothing my suit jacket. "I'll make my entrance just before it arrives." I gave myself one final moment in the small office, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. The doubts that had plagued me the previous night seemed distant now. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition of my pain, my journey, and ultimately my triumph. When I opened my eyes, I was ready. The path to the Versailles room took me through the main dining area, where conversations hushed briefly as I passed. Whether they recognized me or simply responded to the purposeful way I moved through the space, I couldn't say. What mattered was the quiet confidence I projected with each step. Outside the private dining room, I paused. Through the partially frosted glass of the double doors, I could see the blurred outlines of my family and their guests, hear the muffled sounds of their laughter and conversation. For a fleeting second, I was transported back to that painful day 2 years ago, scrolling through Instagram photos of a celebration I had been deemed unworthy to attend. But I was no longer that person. With a subtle nod to the server positioned outside the door, I stepped forward as he swung it open. The conversation didn't stop immediately. It faltered, like a record gradually winding down, as one by one they noticed my presence. My mother saw me first, her champagne flute freezing halfway to her lips. Then my father, his storyteller's hands suspended mid-gesture. Olivia was the last, turning to follow their gaze, her expression morphing from confusion to shock as she recognized me. "Rachel." My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. I smiled, stepping fully into the room. "Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm not interrupting." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with unasked questions. I used it to my advantage, moving to the head of the table, the position my father would normally occupy, and gesturing to the servers who had materialized behind me. Before you begin your celebration, I wanted to welcome you personally to La Pearl. I kept my voice measured, calm. As the new owner, the confused glances exchanged around the table might have been comical under different circumstances. My father was the first to recover, his business instincts kicking in. Owner, he repeated, his tone caught between disbelief and sudden, calculating interest. You bought this restaurant? Not just the restaurant, I clarified. The building itself. And a significant partnership stake in La Pearl's operations. I allowed myself a small smile. Philippe, you may have read about him in Boston Magazine's profile last month, and I have exciting plans for the future. My mother's expression shifted from shock to something more complex, a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. But how, when did you? It's been a busy few years, I answered simply, signaling to the servers to begin pouring a special vintage champagne I had selected for this moment. I've been meaning to share my news with you all, but we've had so few opportunities to connect lately. The subtle rebuke landed exactly as intended. My sister Olivia had the grace to look embarrassed, while my parents exchanged guilty glances. Now, I continued, taking a flute of champagne for myself, I understand we're celebrating a birthday. I turned to Olivia, raising my glass slightly. Happy birthday, sister. I've taken the liberty of enhancing tonight's menu. Philippe has prepared some extraordinary dishes that aren't typically available to the public. As if on cue, the double doors opened again, and a procession of servers entered carrying the first course, a delicate amuse-bouche featuring Ostra caviar on house-made blini. Philippe himself followed, introducing the dish with theatrical flair, his French accent more pronounced than usual for the benefit of the impressed guests. I observed the scene with a peculiar sense of detachment. The expressions around the table ranged from stunned admiration to lingering confusion to, in my father's case, a calculating reassessment. I recognized that look from countless business meetings. He was recategorizing me in his mind, moving me from daughter to potentially valuable connection. The performance aspect of my plan was unfolding perfectly. I had orchestrated a demonstration of power and success that not even my achievement-oriented family could ignore or dismiss. But as I watched their reactions, I realized that the emotional satisfaction I had anticipated, the vindication, the sweet taste of turning the tables, was more complex than I had imagined. Yes, there was satisfaction in their recognition, but beneath it ran a current of something else. Not regret exactly, but understanding. In this moment of triumph, I saw with unexpected clarity that the true value of what I had built wasn't in proving my worth to them, but in discovering it for myself. As the main course was cleared, a perfectly executed duck à l'orange that had elicited genuine moans of pleasure from the table, I caught Philippe's eye and gave him the subtle nod we had arranged. He understood immediately, discreetly directing the staff to provide us with privacy. Within moments, the servers had vanished, the heavy doors closed behind them. The sudden absence of attentive staff created a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The celebratory mood, which had gradually returned as exquisite dish after dish distracted from the initial shock of my appearance, dissipated. In its place settled a tense anticipation. That was quite a meal, my father said, breaking the silence. His tone was jovial but cautious. You've certainly made an impression, Rachel. That wasn't my intention, I replied, which wasn't entirely true. Making an impression had been precisely my intention, just not in the way he assumed. At least, not the only intention. Then what was? Olivia asked, her voice carrying a defensive edge. The champagne had loosened her usual reserve. Because this feels like, I don't know, some kind of power play. I smiled slightly. Does it? I suppose that's fair. My mother reached for her water glass, her hand trembling slightly. Rachel, darling, we're all very impressed and, frankly, surprised by your success. But I'm not sure I understand why you kept all this from us. She gestured around the opulent dining room. This is remarkable, truly. Is it? I asked quietly. Remarkable enough to be included in family celebrations now? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. My mother's face paled as understanding dawned. "This is about Olivia's birthday 2 years ago," she said. In part, I acknowledged, keeping my voice level despite the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. This was the moment I had rehearsed countless times, yet now that it had arrived, I found myself searching for the right words. "I've been reflecting on that day quite a bit," I continued. "Not just the exclusion itself, but what it represented. Do you remember what you told me, Mom? That it was going to be a fancy place, not my type." Those words stayed with me. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And he murmured to my mother, "What exactly did you say to her?" Before she could answer, I pressed on. "It's not about that specific wording, Dad. It's about what it revealed, that in your eyes, I wasn't good enough. Not sophisticated enough, not successful enough, not important enough to be included in celebrations that mattered." "That's not fair," Olivia interjected. "It was my birthday, and I wanted certain people there, that's all." "Certain people," I repeated. "But not your sister." Her cheeks flushed. "We weren't exactly close then, Rachel. You know that." "No, we weren't," I agreed. "And whose responsibility was that?" "We're adults, Olivia. Adults work through disagreements. They don't exclude family from important events over petty arguments." Michael, Olivia's husband, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe we should know," I cut him off, not unkindly. "We need to have this conversation. It's long overdue." I turned back to my family. That day changed me. Being told I wasn't welcome forced me to confront some painful truths about our family dynamic and about myself. My father leaned forward, his businessman's instincts engaging. "And those truths led you to, what? A spectacularly successful career that you kept hidden from us." A small laugh escaped me. "Actually, yes. That rejection became my catalyst. I poured myself into work, not just to succeed, but to transform myself into someone you couldn't dismiss." I gestured around the restaurant. "Someone who owned places like this rather than being excluded from them." The silence that followed was weighted with realization. My mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. My father looked both impressed and unsettled, as though seeing me for the first time. Olivia stared into her wine glass, her expression unreadable. "Rachel," my mother finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "I had no idea that what I said hurt you so deeply. It was thoughtless, cruel even, but never intended to cause such pain." "Intentions don't diminish impact," I replied softly. And it wasn't just that day. It was years of subtle messages that I somehow didn't measure up. That day was simply when I finally heard those messages clearly. My father reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close. "I'm beginning to understand," he said, his usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "And I'm sorry. I should have seen how we were making you feel." For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to accept this partial apology, to smooth things over as I had done countless times before. But I had come too far for half measures. "Did you know," I said, turning to Olivia, "that I had already bought your birthday gift before I was uninvited? A silver bracelet from Tiffany's that you'd mentioned wanting. It cost nearly a month's rent, but I thought it was worth it to see you happy." I smiled sadly. "I still have it somewhere." Olivia's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with one hand. "Rachel, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." The atmosphere shifted, the tension dissolving into something more complex, regret, understanding, perhaps even the beginning of healing. "I didn't orchestrate this evening to make you feel guilty," I said, softening my tone. "Though I won't pretend that wasn't part of my motivation initially. But as I planned it, I realized what I really wanted was for you to see me, truly see me, not as the family disappointment, not as someone unworthy of inclusion, but as I am." My mother wiped away a tear. "And who are you now, Rachel? Beyond this impressive success?" The question caught me off guard. Who was I now? Not just the hurt daughter seeking validation, not just the successful businesswoman proving her worth. Something more complex, more authentic. "I'm someone who built a life on her own terms," I answered slowly. "Someone who learned that external validation, even from family, can't replace self-worth. Someone who discovered that pain can be transformed into power if channeled correctly." I paused, meeting each of their gazes. And someone who, despite everything, still values family enough to want reconciliation, but on new terms, with mutual respect. My father nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Not just a power play then, he said, echoing Olivia's earlier accusation. A renegotiation. Exactly, I confirmed, relieved that he, at least, understood the business terms that framed my emotional needs. What are your terms? He asked, his tone betraying both wariness and genuine curiosity. I took a deep breath. Honesty. Inclusion. Respect for the life I've built, regardless of whether it aligns with your expectations. I looked at each of them in turn. And a commitment to working through issues directly, rather than through exclusion or passive aggression. My family exchanged glances, assessing, considering, perhaps even a little impressed by the clarity of my demands. The dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably. Whether this would lead to healing or further estrangement remained to be seen, but at least the truth hung in the air between us, impossible to ignore or dismiss. In the silence that followed, I sensed we had reached a turning point. Not a neat resolution or a fairy tale reconciliation, but an opening, a chance for something new to emerge from the ashes of old hurts and misunderstandings. The remainder of the evening unfolded with a strange new equilibrium. Philippe returned with dessert, an artful construction of dark chocolate and gold leaf, and conversation resumed, albeit with a different quality than before. The surface topics remained celebratory, appropriate for Olivia's birthday, but undercurrents of awareness flowed beneath each exchange. Glances held longer, words were chosen more carefully, and a newfound attentiveness permeated our interactions. When the celebration concluded, my family lingered while the other guests departed. In the now quiet dining room, my father approached me with an uncharacteristic hesitancy. Your mother and I would like to have you over for dinner next Sunday, he said. Just family. If you're available. I recognized the olive branch for what it was, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. A beginning. I'd like that, I replied, surprised to find I meant it. As they left, Olivia hung back, clutching her small evening bag with both hands, a nervous gesture I remembered from our childhood. Rachel, She started, then faltered. It's okay, I said, not wanting to prolong what had already been an emotionally exhausting evening. No, it's not, she insisted. I need to say this. I was jealous of you. Of all the possible confessions, this one blindsided me completely. Jealous? Of me? She nodded, a wry smile touching her lips. You always seemed so free. You followed your own path, made your own choices, while I was busy fulfilling expectations, ticking off the boxes Mom and Dad laid out for me. Prestigious college, sensible career, appropriate husband. She gestured vaguely toward the departed Michael. When we argued, it wasn't really about the car. It was about the fact that you lived authentically, and I resented you for it. The revelation left me momentarily speechless. All those years I had envied her apparent perfection, her seeming ease at meeting our parents' expectations, while she had envied my independence. The irony was almost too much. We've been idiots, haven't we? I finally said. Her laugh, tinged with both sadness and relief, broke the remaining tension between us. Complete idiots, she agreed. Do you think, could we try again? As adults this time. I found myself nodding, a cautious hope rising within me. I'd like that. After they had all gone, I remained in the empty restaurant, sipping a final glass of wine as the staff quietly reset the room for tomorrow's service. Philippe joined me briefly, curious about how the evening had unfolded, but too discreet to ask directly. Your family seemed moved by the experience, he observed carefully. Yes, I agreed. Though not necessarily by your duck à l'orange, exceptional as it was. He laughed, accepting the deflection with good grace. The best meals nourish more than just the body, NSC pa? When I finally returned to my Beacon Hill home in the early hours of the morning, I felt a curious lightness. Not happiness exactly, the evening had been too complex, too emotionally fraught for simple happiness, but something akin to release. as if a tightly wound spring within me had finally been allowed to expand to its natural state. The days that followed brought a gradual recalibration of my family relationships. Sunday dinner at my parents' Brookline home was awkward but genuine. My mother asked about Bean and Brew, showing interest in the details of my business for perhaps the first time. My father, true to his nature, had researched Brew Swift and wanted to discuss expansion strategies. Olivia and I made tentative plans to meet for lunch the following week. None of it was perfect. Old dynamics threatened to reassert themselves at times. My mother's casual critiques, my father's assumption that his business advice was inherently superior to my experience, Olivia's occasional retreat into familiar patterns of competition. But each time, there was also a new awareness, a catching of themselves in these behaviors, and often, an explicit course correction. Meanwhile, I found myself reevaluating my own motivations and choices. Had I truly built my business empire for myself, or had it been an elaborate demonstration for my family's benefit? The question nagged at me as I moved through my daily routines, meeting with investors, overseeing operations at Bean and Brew, collaborating with Philippe on improvements to La Pearl's menu and service. It came to a head one morning as I sat in my office overlooking Boston Common, reviewing quarterly projections. The numbers were excellent, exceeding even my optimistic forecasts. By any objective measure, I had achieved extraordinary success. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted after that confrontational dinner. The driving force that had propelled me forward seemed diminished somehow. On impulse, I called Tara, who had remained my steadfast friend through all the changes in my life. "I think I'm having an existential crisis," I told her when she answered. "Before noon on a Tuesday? That's ambitious even for you," she replied, her dry humor a familiar comfort. "What's going on?" I struggled to articulate the nebulous feeling. I achieved everything I set out to do. I proved my worth to my family, forced them to see me. But now that I've done it. "Now you're wondering if you've been defining yourself in opposition to them all this time?" she finished for me. "Exactly," I admitted. "If I'm not the overlooked daughter fighting for recognition anymore, who am I?" "Oh, honey," Tara said, her voice softening. "You're Rachel Bennett, coffee empress and real estate mogul. You're my brilliant, stubborn friend who built an empire. You're someone who values authenticity enough to orchestrate an elaborate confrontation to get it. None of that changes just because your family finally sees what I've always seen in you." Her words lodged in my chest, warming something that had gone cold with doubt. "When did you get so wise?" I asked. "I've always been wise. You've just been too busy planning revenge scenarios to notice," she teased. After we hung up, I turned back to my work with renewed focus. Perhaps the motivation had shifted, but the passion remained. I loved what I had built. The satisfaction of creating something meaningful, businesses that employed people, spaces that brought communities together, products that enhanced daily lives, was real and substantial, independent of any need for validation. In the months that followed, this realization formed the foundation for a profound personal transformation. I began to view my success not as a shield against rejection or a weapon of vindication, but as an authentic expression of my capabilities and vision. The businesses I had built weren't just proof of my worth, they were extensions of my values and creativity. My relationship with my family continued to evolve as well. There were setbacks, old wounds reopened during a particularly tense Thanksgiving dinner, a disagreement over Christmas plans that threatened to revert us to former patterns. But each time, we found our way back to the new understanding we had established that night at La Pearl. Not perfect, not without effort, but genuine in a way our previous interactions had never been. Perhaps most significantly, I discovered that forgiveness, both of my family and myself, wasn't a single act but a continuous process. Some days it came easier than others. There were moments when the memory of that painful exclusion still stung, when I caught myself armoring up against potential rejection. But increasingly, I could recognize these reactions for what they were, echoes of old pain, not reflections of my current reality. A year after the confrontation, I found myself back at La Pearl, seated at the same table in the Versailles room. This time, I had gathered my family to announce a new venture, a foundation dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. As I outlined the vision, I noticed my mother wiping away a tear. "What's wrong?" I asked, pausing in my presentation. She shook her head, smiling through her emotion. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just proud. So incredibly proud of the woman you've become." The words washed over me, and I waited for the familiar hunger for approval to surface, for the need to catalog this validation and store it against future rejections. But instead, I felt only a quiet contentment. Her pride was welcome, meaningful even, but no longer essential to my sense of self. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the transformation I had undergone was complete. The bitter rejection that had once defined me had been transmuted into something precious: self-knowledge, resilience, and a deep understanding that true worth comes not from external validation, but from living authentically and purposefully. The path had been unconventional, even painful at times, but it had led me precisely where I needed to be, not just to success, but to myself.